I didn't even think anybody else was coming by here today. But you know what? I'm glad you did. We got a lot to talk about. On this installment of Psych Rad, I'm going to talk a bit about my dear old dad. Nope, that's not him. That's a picture of Jack Nicholson in The Shining. But Jack's performance in the film always reminds me of my father, so that should tell you something. With that said, the part of Dad in this little ditty will be played by animated Jack. Like most folks from my generation, I grew up on a steady diet of violent cartoons. Tom and Jerry, the Flintstones, and good old Bugs Bunny gave me a daily dose of vitamin V. And although the violence in these cartoons may have influenced some of my thoughts and behaviors, it was likely my father's violent and recalcitrant nature that influenced me the most. It seems like many parents tend to blame everything but themselves for their children's behavioral problems, when in fact, they are many times the direct cause. My father, for example, was physically and psychologically abusive towards me as a child and into my teenage years, and I in turn modeled this violence by hitting, pinching, and pushing my little brother, which many times would consequently lead to more abusive discipline from Dad. Thus, my early family life was a continuous cycle of violence that was only interrupted when Dad wasn't around. In the Tom and Jerry cartoons, Tom hurts Jerry and Jerry hurts Tom, and they continue in this pattern which results in their own cycle of violence. But in real life, my father was much bigger and stronger than me, and I could not physically fight back like the courageous little mouse. Thus, I subjected others to violence, i.e. picking on my brother and getting into fights at school. But for the most part, I turned the violence inward through risk-taking behavior, drug and alcohol abuse, and some self-harm in the form of cutting and burning myself. Another way in which my father influenced my young mind was through his open use of illicit drugs in my presence. As a child, I observed my father and his friends use drugs on a regular basis. In fact, it was so common that I wouldn't have known it was inappropriate if my father hadn't have told me to never tell anyone about it. Inevitably, my father's drug use grew and expanded into the use of harder drugs, namely cocaine. And as his drug use increased, so did the abuse he inflicted upon me. The physical abuse alone was enough to cause me to develop any number of psychological disturbances. But add to this the constant exposure to illicit drug use, and you have the perfect recipe for a half-baked juvenile delinquent. As I grew into a teenager, my own interest in illicit drugs further developed, and I found myself doing drugs with Dad. And when I wasn't getting high with Dad, I was getting high with a little help from my friends. Needless to say, I continued to use drugs and alcohol for many years after this, long after my father's influence was no longer a factor, and it subsequently caused much dysfunction and chaos in my young life. After nearly 2 decades of absolutely no communication with my father, I finally confronted him some years ago about the way in which he raised me and the physical abuse he subjected me to. His only response was that we both had things to be sorry for, as if he were attempting to shrug it off and avoid any sincere acknowledgement of his wrongdoings. I was extremely upset with his apparent lack of remorse, and after writing him a rather angry retort, I decided that it was best to let sociopathic dogs lie, and have not spoken to him since. And although I would like to be able to forgive my father and re-establish some form of father-son relationship, I cannot simply suppress the resentment I harbor for his lack of remorse. In an article written by editor-at-large at Psychology Today, Hera Morano, she addresses the pitfalls of parents who use drugs and the effect it has on their children. I found her advice in the article about forgiveness to be very insightful. According to Morano, forgiveness is itself a fine emotion, but it is debased if it is granted promiscuously. In other words, she discourages premature or undeserved forgiveness. Morano also recommends there be preconditions for granting forgiveness, such as sincere apologies and openly expressed remorse. And I am inclined to agree with Morano in that forgiveness must be earned by those who have wronged you, or it contaminates the gesture.
I'm sorry! I'm sorry!
Other than forgiveness is not always deserved, the moral of this story is an obvious one, and that is kids learn by example, so do your best to set a good one. In the words of Albert Bandura, the father of social learning theory, setting an example is not the main means of influencing another, it is the only means. So you might have had a bad dad, but that doesn't mean you have to be just like him. Modeling can account for certain learned behaviors, but at some point you have to take responsibility for your own actions and learn to do better.